Okay, perfect. Okay, we'll go ahead and get rolling. Thanks for bearing with us there. I'm Blake Subchak, managing editor of README, a new cybersecurity publication backed by SYNAC. We're here for, this is my first hybrid panel moderation here. So bear with us. I think we're just getting video set up for two of our other panelists, but I'm thrilled to be joined here by several experts and leading figures really leading the charge in this fight against ransomware that's threatened critical infrastructure in the US and globally. And so as soon as, I'll hold tight until we get video, but I will intro our panelists then. And in the meantime, I just kind of wanted to set the stage for a second. This is such a critical issue, and there has been such a proliferation of ransomware threats in recent years, as we heard earlier this morning. And really, as an editor of a cybersecurity publication, it's such a routinely headline grabbing event, right? When a ransomware case strikes a critical infrastructure organization. And so I think we'll kind of dig into the response elements and just how some of these figures are dealing with it. I will say, I did want to kick things off once we do get Danielle and Kurt joining us here virtually by diving into a little bit of a case study. So I'll kind of give the background there before we do the introductions, which is in January, there were several large oil terminals at ports. Oh, hello. Okay, here we go. Kurt, can you hear us? And Danielle?
We can hear you.
Gotcha.
All right, perfect. So I'll quickly do the introductions. So as mentioned, I'm Blake Subchak, managing editor of README. We have Kurt John here with us, Chief Cybersecurity Officer at Siemens USA, and a senior fellow as well at the Atlanta Council of Cyber Statecraft Initiative. We have Danielle Jablansky joining us from Nozomi Networks, where she is OT cybersecurity strategist. Here we have Daniel Bardenstein, who's here from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and works as their tech strategy and implementation lead. And finally, Jason Tama joins us from the White House, where he is director of Resilience and Response at the National Security Council. So thank you all so much for joining us here for this important conversation. And as I was mentioning, I just wanted to step back and kind of zoom in on this case study from January, where there were the Black Cat ransomware group, part of the Russian-speaking cybercriminal underground, struck several oil terminals in Europe and really disrupted energy supply chains there at a pretty intense time, even before the start of the Ukraine conflict. And really, I was just hoping to start if each of you could kind of walk through what some of your takeaways were from that event and just what it says about the state of the ransomware threat to critical infrastructure in particular today. So I guess with that, Kurt, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. It's going to sound cliche, but it really was a wake-up call, to be honest, right? We've been sort of wargaming, pontificating, simulating for quite some time. What type of, and we actually knew, right, there was inappropriate access within various aspects of our critical infrastructure at different points for quite some time. And I think this, along with a few others that happened in the last couple of years, the last 18 months really highlighted first, issues with our overall supply chain. The second is the inherent issues when it comes to OT, right? Is sort of decades old hardware and in some cases software, and how difficult it is to marry that with the advanced manufacturing and the other aspects of digitalization and Industry X.0 that we're trying to drive forward. The fact that it's much more than just a cyber risk. It really is a national security risk, right? That can impact our economy, our way of life. So all that, it just sort of congealed at that point, at least for me, that it's an uphill battle. I don't think it's a battle that we can defend and hopefully be successful. But that's the point at which I really started to really delve into the topic at large and really try to drive partnerships such as the one that I have with the Atlantic Council now.
And Danielle, what were some of your takeaways from that event in Europe that disrupted energy supply chains there?
I like that we've started with this case study, and thanks, Blake, and to the organizers and everyone for having us here in this hybrid capacity. So we just heard from a member of Congress that there's this great power conflict brewing, and there's all these asymmetric threats in this conversation around deterrence. And when we look at the ability to disable ports, terminals, and supply chains, we really kind of step into transnational criminal activity that we've known for a long time. And so there's a trivia question I like to ask people, which is the number one smuggled good in the United States for a very long time has often been cigarettes, to avoid taxes on that good that's traded. And so many of you have heard me talk about, I see cyber attacks on critical infrastructure as an extension of civil society rather than military targets. And so I think that this really illuminates that. And in another talk, I didn't coin this term, but I've called cyber capabilities weapons of mass disruption a number of times. And I think that is what we will continue to see across the board. I think we've just seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of ransomware targets. Not counting, and this is kind of a prelude to my conversation later on standards, not counting oil ports and terminals, I was able as an analyst to roughly uncover 8 million targets across 4 verticals in this space, to include energy, water, food manufacturing, and critical manufacturing globally. So the number of potential targets that are out there, and the fact that they are an extension of civil society, we don't have good definitions around that disruption or that impact in terms of great power competition, leaves us kind of in this vacuum, as Rob was talking about in the opening panel. And the last thing I'll say, which again is a prelude to my conversation this afternoon on standards, is that we've talked a lot about the security implications of, hyperconnectivity, all of the systems that maybe are built on top of legacy systems that we rely on for critical infrastructure. What we haven't done enough analysis on is the fallout, right? So that is something we do well when it comes to weapons, right? We understand the fallout of weapons and their capacity. We don't understand the true fallout of all of the things that we now recognize need better security. So that's kind of my takeaways.
Thank you. And Daniel, from your vantage at CISA, which is, of course, the lead civilian cybersecurity agency here in the US, how did you view this episode across the Atlantic?
So from my perspective, it feels a lot like sort of business as usual, not in a good way, but in the sense that a lot of this activity has been going on for a long time. I think what some people might see as a wake-up call, I think it helps refocus people on how broad critical infrastructure really is and what it really means, right? We often think about water and power. We point to Oldsmar and Colonial Pipeline. But previously, before coming to CISA, I led cybersecurity for Operation Warp Speed, which is the government's effort to rapidly research, distribute, and administer vaccines. And so there are a lot of companies all throughout, for example, the vaccine supply chain that wouldn't necessarily consider themselves innately critical manufacturing or something outsized impact on the larger country or national security. But when you realize, hey, there's maybe a very small number of manufacturers that make this very particular type of glass vial in which all our COVID vaccines went, all of a sudden that becomes much more important. So I think part of it is just continuing. I think of it like one of the phrases that went around the country a lot in the wake of 9/11, which is a lack of creativity or imagination in terms of what the threat can be. So I think that continues to grow and expand for many folks. Again, this is nothing was necessarily new. There was a new capability deployed. Not necessarily new types of adversaries or goals, but it's constantly getting people to see, oh, what is the scope of what an adversary might do? And then we need to make sure we respond in kind. The other thing for me, and I can be kind of a stickler for the basics and the foundational bits, is the way they got in, according to the initial reports, was through a previously unknown gateway, which often reads as there was something on the public internet that had an exploitable vulnerability. Which is the case for how many ransomware attacks start and many non-ransomware cyber incidents start. And so I think in these cases, we often jump to thinking about, okay, how do we secure the OT and evolve the OT, which we absolutely should be doing. And as we continue, I think the stat is in 2021 or even the first half of the 22 so far, we've seen the most number of ICS-specific vulnerabilities that have been published, compared to previous time segments. But at the end of the day, we're all back to this. If every critical infrastructure entity could deploy tools, and there are many that are free or cheap, not just the big commercial solutions, that could identify what assets do you have on the public internet, how do you make sure that there's nothing there that can be easily exploited. I think that would, that's known stuff. It's almost, I don't want to say a solved problem, but that in of itself would significantly reduce the impact of just initial access that a lot of ransomware operators get. So for me, it's less of a new thing, but it reminds people, hey, this is what adversaries are capable of, and this is where we're not looking when we're just thinking about power and water. There's a lot more to that, but those are the fundamental ones. And from the security side, just all back to basics.
And Jason, I do want to let you, thank you for that. I do want to let you riff on this sort of notion of the IT OT angle here. But, looking at Black Hat again, that operates under what's known as a ransomware as a service model, where basically you have the architect and author of the malware actually renting that out to affiliates who then actually deploy it against victims and then offer a cut back to the original malware author. And one of the challenges there, and a question I have for you, Jason, is just how important is it to distinguish between who's actually launching the attack and who's building the tools that enable this capability when you're talking about a threat like Black Hat?
Everybody hear me? Mic's working.
I'm not sure if that's.
Let me try again. Mic's working.
We can hear you.
This.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, well, we can switch mics if need be. Hey, you feel like you can't
Yeah,
hear me?
I think in the crowd maybe. Does that work? I think that should be on.
All right, any better? Yeah, that's better. Okay. All right. Hey, good morning, folks. And first, thanks to Blake and fellow panelists for the chance to be with you today, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting. It's great to be here. Great to be here in person or in hybrid, whatever we're calling it. So yeah, we could talk a lot about this, and I know we will throughout the panel, and I'll try to add some texture to what was already said because I think the other panelists made some great points. First on takeaways, I think overall I would just characterize the recognition or awareness of two things. One, supply chain vulnerabilities, which we already heard about, which I think Americans and internationally really became acutely aware of this during the COVID epidemic, right? When you had shortages for toilet paper, computer chips, you name it, and Americans became acutely aware of their dependence on the global supply chain, particularly their dependence on the functioning of our ports. The same can be said certainly for fuel, which was impacted in this case. So that's point one. And whether the supply chain impact is a result of something like COVID with huge workforce disruptions, or in this case, a ransomware incident, we've got significant vulnerabilities that we need to work to close there, not only from a technical perspective, but just in terms of how we are structured and how we are structured as a nation, as a world, in terms of our supply chain. So that's my first point. Second point would be growing convergence between the cyber and physical domains, and I know we'll talk about this more. But I think when you look at incidents like this, and I know we're probably going to talk about Colonial Pipeline, but gone are the days where you can look at cyber and physical risks and associated resilience in silos. And we can talk about the same for IT and OT, and whether you have direct connectivity or not, just the dependencies that businesses have to continue to function with the reliance on their IT networks, whether they have any direct operational nexus or not. And so I know we'll talk about that. With respect to ransomware particularly, I think huge focus at the White House, huge focus across the entire interagency. We track these threats very, very closely, regular battle rhythm at the White House in terms of evaluating what threats are out there. And I think, we try to bring a very holistic perspective to this and not get fixated on one particular threat actor or one particular variant. We have to look at all, and we have to be ready. I'm sadly dealing with a few mice in my house. I live in a very old house, and you're probably like, why is he talking about this? The mice found vulnerabilities in my house, and they've found their way in. This is what we are dealing with. It's a persistent threat, and we need to work together to deal with it. You can tell me how that mice metaphor worked later. Okay. Thanks.
I think that works well. Gaps in the defenses of your home there, and that's hope you get that settled. I'm glad you brought up. Yeah, the attack surface, exactly. I'm sure there are some puns that some of our journalism friends can come up with in the crowd here. So I did want to build on. I'm glad you brought up Colonial Pipeline because I feel like that was really, again, to use a bit of a cliche, an eye-opening, game-changing, really sound the alarm sort of moment for U.S. critical infrastructure. And there, of course, I'm sure all of you remember it well, but there was a ransomware attack later attributed to the DarkSide group that actually caused a year ago, almost exactly, Colonial Pipeline to shut off about half the fuel supplies to the entire U.S. East Coast as they remediated this. Now, in that instance, I believe it was not actually the operational technology or OT network that was directly affected, but the impact was still there, right? And you still had this disruption of fuel supplies. And it's hard not to see these parallels with the Black Cat also targeting oil. Granted, Colonial Pipeline was more refined fuels, gasoline, that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering, if something like that happened today to U.S. critical infrastructure with the tensions in Ukraine, with Russia's invasion, how does that response look different? And I guess, Jason, I don't know if we can start with you. This is something you have to think about.
Yeah, sure. Let me say a few words about Colonial. I've been at the National Security Council about a year. Got there, I think it was the week after the Colonial incident, and there was it was a very serious incident, as you all know, with impacts, very serious impacts to our supply chain and to millions of Americans. I think for some of you that have been working in this space a long time, this won't be a surprise, but I think there were many that were surprised by the fact that a ransomware attack on an IT system could result in the total shutdown of a major piece of infrastructure. And I will just tell a very brief story. My background is U.S. Coast Guard. I came to the NSC from the Coast Guard. And in my previous role, I led operations in the Port of New York. A couple of years ago, we had a vessel come in that had a IT compromise. And I remember speaking to the ship operators and the company, and they said, hey, this is only impacting our IT systems. There'll be no impact on operations. Yet when you pull on that thread, right, the IT system is what the ship basically uses to communicate for logistics, to track cargo manifests, to track who's on board, for transactions with third-party vendors and entities, weather routing system. The list could go on and on and on. So while you could physically power and steer the ship, without IT, you are not going to be able to successfully operate that vessel or the maritime supply chain system in today's modern environment. And we crossed that Rubicon years ago. And the same became abundantly clear with Colonial, right? They lost their IT system and had no ability to essentially function and keep that pipeline operating. And I think we understand there was a deliberate decision made to shut down the pipeline for a number of reasons, probably good reasons from a risk management perspective. But there's a huge should be for some it was a wake-up call. For others, it's what they've been saying for quite a long time. So I think we need to remember that, and the same applies to the case in January. And we have to think about that in terms of how we structure our response and our preparedness efforts. And then I'll say two other things, and I'll try to wrap this up. I think the second thing is, that's this point on cyber physical convergence, and we have to focus on resilience. And I'm the director of resilience and response, so I've got to say this, but not only cyber, but physical resilience. And what are our expectations as a nation, as shareholders, whatever, for critical infrastructure owners and operators in terms of to be resilient and to be able to continue to operate in a degraded digital environment? It's an open question. Look forward to having that discussion. We need to figure out what our expectations are, because clearly, because of some of these incidents, we're not there and we don't have that resilience. And then the last point I'll say in the context of Russia-Ukraine, the president's been very forward-leading, predating the Russia-Ukraine crisis about his expectations with respect to protecting our critical infrastructure. And I think, we don't want to rest on our laurels, but thankfully we haven't seen, a major incident since Colonial here in the United States. But I think we're definitely not out of the woods yet. The conflict in Russia-Ukraine, the Russians' invasion of Ukraine is ongoing, still very dangerous and dynamic situation. And we need to think in this era of great power competition, what does critical infrastructure protection look like? Are we entering an era of a new Cold War? If we rewind the tape to the Cold War, imagine how that might be different if the Soviets had access to some of our critical systems, and what that might look like, and what does that mean for us in the future. And I'll stop to not hog too much time.
Yeah, well, thank you for that insight. And Daniel, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit, a year on from Colonial Pipeline, what's different if something were to happen like that today, God forbid, how does the response look different?
It's a tricky question. I think ideally, again, we keep bringing up this idea of wake-up calls, and even in the initial conversation, sometimes unfortunately, as much as there have been people who've been predicting many of these types of events for decades, it takes these large-scale events to cause behavior change. At the end of the day, this is about behavior change. So I'd like to think that if this were to happen again, people might be a little bit more fortified, or have some at least thought about it a little bit more. But the reality is, to really grow a good product security program or an internal security program when you don't have one, it takes a long time. It takes longer than a year. So I think both from the government perspective and from the critical infrastructure perspective, we still have a long way to go. I experienced Colonial Pipeline in a very different way than most. I was down in the Florida Panhandle leading a red team at an Air Force base on their facility-related control systems and their water and power systems. And when we were driving to lunch, there's a huge backup cars backed up to get into the gas station. And we're like, what is going on? And that's how I learned about Colonial. So you really see kind of how these things manifest. But again, I think the ideal that we aspire to is not that far away. I mean, again, within the last year and a half, there's a story, and I'm blanking on which company. It was a Japanese manufacturing company that didn't really make much news because it went as future ransomware events should go, which is the company got popped, they got ransomed, and they said, oh, we have backups for all of our critical systems that we've been regularly testing and restoring from nothing. So they said, take our key, take our data, take our keys, we're fine. Because they had segmented all their more private, sensitive data away. And it really wasn't much of a news story because they just restored back their system. So there are good examples out there, as much as we like to point to all of the failures out there. So I think it'll be continued work into the previous conversation from a government perspective. Especially CISA, we're not a regulatory agency, but we're trying to always figure out how can we better partner with industry to affect behavior change, right? A lot of the people we work with know that this needs to be a problem. Sometimes it's about clarifying best practices. Sometimes it's how do you work with C-suites to invest in this stuff. There's a whole range of things. And I'll just also make a call. CISA is always looking to partner with folks at all levels. So if folks want to come find me afterwards and figure out how you can work with us and we can work with you to help your industry, your problem areas, how can you make us better? By all means, we're always looking to chat. So feel free to find me afterwards, and I'll pass it along.
Great. And yeah, Kurt or Danielle, anything to add on the Colonial Pipeline a year on? And again, what would look different now, especially with the tensions in Russia and Ukraine?
Go ahead, Danielle.
Sure. One thing that I don't think I heard Jason and Daniel mention was there was actually a fairly swift law enforcement response to Colonial Pipeline that we hadn't seen so quickly and avidly in past attacks. And so I think, we say, God forbid, another one of these situations happens. I do think we will see another similar type of incident, because there's been a full realization that operations that tolerate little to no physical downtime are lucrative targets. But what this really brings up is the fact that there's a limited capacity to then go out and police the world in cyber, for lack of a better kind of analogy. And so that gap, kind of back to Jason's mice analogy, if you have a few mice, you can set out traps. If you have many, you call an exterminator. If it overwhelms your building, you might have to burn it all. And so that capacity to respond swiftly and the decisions in which we choose to respond with a law enforcement capacity, I think will get more entangled. And that comes back to Daniel's point on, there are free and easy to deploy kind of tools to understand maybe the topology of your public risk. But then there are more sophisticated tools that we really focus on reducing the severity, not if, but when you are the target of a similar attack. So those are kind of two things I wanted to highlight in addition to the comments that have already been shared.
I'll mention, I like the comment before about there being a layer between the infrastructure the adversaries are using and the people who are actually want to own the mission, if you will. Because there's been a significant increase in maturation of adversaries' command and control infrastructure. They scale well, and they're getting more and more mature, which means they can run the infrastructure and abstract the mission. So someone comes and it's basically hacking as a service. So it's going to be interesting to see how we navigate the people that are running the infrastructure versus the people that are trying to accomplish a particular goal. Now, with regards to your question, this is going to be interesting as well. And I would think industry, CISA, the White House, ONCD, ODNI, all of us should be sort of wargaming. How do we do this? Because with the new infrastructure law that was passed, there's going to be significant modernization of multiple aspects of our critical infrastructure, both like hardware, like bridges and roads, but then also advanced manufacturing, and the list goes on. And what's happening with advanced manufacturing and just Industry X.0 right now, there's 5G, there's edge computing, grid edge, there's artificial intelligence, and the nexus for most of the things that would be a big driver for digitalization in the industrial space is going to be cloud. And so I know there's been some conversations of cloud in general in the US and practically globally being also a form of critical infrastructure, a critical infrastructure vertical. And that's going to drive even stronger convergence of IT and OT. And so it's a very complex problem, because then you have, I always tell this story. I remember Siemens sold a turbine to a company in the Middle East in the 60s or 70s, 50s, 60s or 70s. And then they called it the Beast. And then the Beast broke down one day in the 2010s, and they called us up, and we went out there and we looked at it and we said, hey, you know what? We can retrofit this, or you can get a new one. If you get a new one, uses less fuel, produces more energy, super efficient comparatively to the Beast. And they were like, no, we love it. And so we retrofitted it. And so something been running for 50 years is probably going to run for another 20, 30. How do you manage? Meanwhile, the infrastructure around the Beast is 2015 and later. So how do you manage those types of risks where you have decades old hardware and software, and then we're also driving forward on a digitalization front? And so I think there needs to be a couple of different aspects. The first is strong security by design, and in terms of products that was mentioned before. The second is good deployment. The third is, and when it comes to the industrial space, they tend to be very low margins, right? So the owners and operators and the other people, the integrators, tend to have pretty low margins, and so they don't spend a lot on security. So I also see a space for organizations like CISA to play a role where, NIST already does a lot on the guidance front, but CISA really can play a strong role in giving actual tactical tools that these owners and operators can use to help fill that talent gap. So in other words, when Spring4Shell or Log4j happened, could CISA issue, and I know there's some complications with this, but just thinking outside the box, could CISA have given through some type of trusted source scripts and guidance on how to run that to identify whether or not you have a vulnerability, and the list goes on and on. So very strong public-private partnership, because the risks are going to increase. I think the opportunities are going to increase as well, but then so will the risks.
I love your anecdote about the Beast. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, so somebody in the comments really briefly mentioned Norsk Hydro, and back to the talent portion and some of the red team stuff that Daniel was mentioning. I like to OSINT job posts. There's a lot you can find out about the technology that companies and even federal providers and vendors focus on by reading what they're hiring for, right? Some of the credentials in terms of the technologists that they look for in the talent pool. And so after Norsk Hydro kind of came out and said, yeah, this happened, they didn't just go out, and back to Daniel's point about behavior change, and say we need to do MFA or we need to hire a SOC analyst. They hired a pen tester. And that's actually a really great example of something that went unnoticed that was a big change in terms of industrial cybersecurity, where they said, you know what, we're just going to fully invest in red teaming ourselves. And that's a shift that I don't think we pay enough attention to in the talent and kind of behavior change aspect. So, and again, the Beast makes me just think of the Sandlot. So thanks for that.
Well, I am thinking about, I know many critical infrastructure operators tend to have a little bit, we'll say, older computer systems running some of this stuff that's just so integral to our well-being and to everyday life here in the US. And historically, there's been this sort of notion of security by obscurity of, okay, no one can get to this. It's totally isolated from the internet. And even if they did get to it, they wouldn't know what to do with it or how to affect some sort of physical consequence. I guess, how has the ransomware threat in recent years changed how the ICS community assesses these threats to the OT layer of things? And maybe, Jason, if we can start with you on that one.
Sure, I'll say a couple things. First, I appreciate Danielle laying out the escalatory ladder of dealing with the mice in my house. And I will.
Hopefully we won't burn it
Yeah, I
down.
hope we won't burn it down, but glad the analogy worked a little bit. Yeah, let me answer the question this way. I think, and I think Daniel can talk a little bit about this from the CISA perspective as well. You know, we have a framework for securing critical infrastructure in the United States, and we're constantly looking at that framework and how do we need to update that framework. It's a few years old now, and it's a very dynamic risk environment, and things are changing. You know, we break up critical infrastructure into different sectors, as you all know. And to your point, Blake, you know, there's different levels of maturity, different levels of understanding, different levels of investment in the age of the infrastructure and the ICS systems in particular. And, you know, where we are with our financial system versus where we are with oil and gas versus where we are in the electricity sector versus where we are health, medical, water, municipal water supply. They're all very different things. And there are different vulnerabilities, different risks associated with that. So how do we make sure the rising tide lifts all boats? And I think we're at this stage where those that are experts in this field have been, you know, sounding the alarm for years on cyber risks and vulnerability. And, you know, we used to talk about, hey, we've got to get it out of, we've got to get it into the C-suite, integrated with other risks that need to be managed. It can't just be a CISO function, if you will. And I think everybody's getting that now. Now we're at the point where what do we do about it? And that's those are very hard conversations. So I think the way we are thinking about that is looking across all sectors and making sure that we have a framework in place that can elevate everybody's game. And I'm sure Daniel probably has some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I could talk a little bit more about kind of CISA's approach and how we're trying to approach this problem. So again, the behavior change is a phrase I utter a lot at work as well. So a number of things that we're trying to do to, again, help close some of these gaps, and even to Danielle's point, kind of offer more helpful services or prescriptive tools. So we already have a suite of free and available tools that partners can sign up for. You can find them on the website. And those have been there for a while. They're more tailored towards IT. And so another thing we're trying to address is, hopefully from all the things we've learned over, with IT security over the years, can we leapfrog how quickly we get to the same or similar level of maturity on the OT side? Because we know, again, preaching to the crowd here, there's not always parity between what you from an IT security perspective and OT security perspective. So, we have free and available services for scanning your attack service or public-facing IP address. It can be a little bit more tricky, as we all know, with control systems. So part of it is looking at internally at what are new capabilities that we can deploy and then offer broadly across sectors to help with some of these OT-specific approaches to common security problems. We're also working in conjunction with NSC and ONC and others on what are being called the cybersecurity performance goals or the cross-sector performance goals. What are clear, easy to follow, measurable, attestable goals that critical infrastructure operators and their chains of command can implement to better secure not just their organizations, but actually effectively reduce the risk to national security. So that's an ongoing effort, and we'll be, we are actively soliciting feedback from this private sector and industry and critical infrastructure as well to make sure, again, it's a partnership, one of CISA's favorite words. And we've also been going sector by sector and doing these 100-day sprints. So we've done pipelines and electricity. We're in the middle of water, soon to be kicking off chemical. So doing these very targeted efforts with many of the larger players and coordinating councils within each of these sectors to try to make meaningful advances in security in those sectors, which is not an easy problem. But at the end of the day, as CISA, we see ourselves as enablers. So how can we make it as easy as possible for the people whose job it is to secure these systems, to effectively do their job and to evolve how they not just protect themselves from ransomware, but any IT and OT threat that's out there.
Danielle, Kurt, anything to add on security by obscurity, ransomware threats kind of undermining that notion if it wasn't already quite retired?
I think security by obscurity is dead. I think we all know that. I really like Daniel's point on clear, measurable goals. I kind of call out a lot of sectors, including insurance and others, for not having baselines, which is ironic because machine learning and AI have been so focused on baselines and behavior analytics over a number of years, but we haven't had some standardized kind of goals to look back and say, wow, this really does work. Wow, this is a good tactic. Wow, this holds up over time. Because there weren't clear and measurable goals across industries that we could really align on for a number of years. And I think we need to extend those baselines, whether it is behavior learning or plausibility checks for physical operations or security policies and supply chain ramifications. So I think that's really the future. And we're one Assistis partners, so I'm glad to be part of it.
I think we're getting there because at the end of the day, what these owners, operators, integrators, what they need to understand is how do I best protect legacy hardware and software? And then how should I be thinking about my modernization efforts, right? Because that legacy software is there. There's going to be a huge influx of funds for modernization, and there's bits and pieces of information on the web. But I think, and so far, I really like, what Daniel is saying, because I think this is heading in the right direction to help abstract that problem, so that if an owner operator goes to a certain place, because we'll never get rid of this ransomware issue, and maybe that's a controversial statement, but I don't think we will. The question is, how do you manage the risk? How do you manage it as best as possible across the critical infrastructure sectors? And so if we can have very clear, concise messaging or resources that someone who and most don't have the expertise can figure out how to do both, I think we'll be well off heading in the right direction.
So Danielle, oh, sorry, did you have something to add there, Jason?
Yeah. Just very quickly, one point, just building on the metrics conversation. I think, a question we've asked ourselves, through the Russia-Ukraine crisis and CIS's Shields Up initiative and the declassification of intelligence and pushing alerts out. And by the way, there's always a good reason to push something out. The question is, what is the private sector, what are state and local entities doing with that information, and how do you measure actions that are being taken? And it's an open question that we continue to struggle with. In the physical domain, it's a little bit easier. Hey, there's a security threat. What have you done? Oh, we've posted an extra guard out front, or we've done this mitigation measure. We don't really have those feedback mechanisms, and we don't have necessarily those metrics and/or standards, if you will. So great points.
So Danielle, I actually wanted to seize on a point that Daniel made earlier with this Japanese company that was hit by ransomware and had backups and succeeded in basically staying out of the headlines. And but that said, this sort of cut and dried definition of ransomware as just encrypting critical data and holding the decryptor out for a ransom. You have so many new twists coming from these ransomware groups, and you have extortion now where they're stealing the data and threatening to release it. I'm wondering if you could speak to where you see the ransomware threat evolving from here for OT specifically.
Did you say Danielle or Daniel?
Yeah, sorry, Danielle. I know yeah.
Yeah, my brother's middle name is Daniel, so welcome to my entire childhood. I think what really this calls into question is business continuity, which is a pillar of the work that we do in my entire field, which is risk mitigation requires a whole of business approach. And I kind of started to touch on this earlier, where people have really well understood the modernization efforts, where we're going in terms of technology, why it's more efficient, why we need the data, why more connected devices is kind of a scary thing for security, but they haven't done the full analysis to say, well, given a whole business approach, what does the fallout look like? What are all the ramifications across all the departments? And I think that the example that you're giving, they did that, right? But also we can't discredit the innovation of threat actors, like somebody else said, and the command and control that they're able to develop, and the kind of native technology that they're beginning to understand and utilize. And so I think that this, if we just had the metrics conversation, the best answer to this, can you restore from backups? That question is the first or second question in any tabletop exercise, any simulation, right? Somebody that's wearing the hat of the C-suite or investor team or the legal or compliance hat says, can we restore from backups, right? And people kind of trickle down to the more technical conversations when they do those. But also it's really important and paramount that non-technical stakeholders across critical infrastructure sectors are also part of the conversations to determine the critical functions and the business continuity, because that goes back to Colonial, right? Not understanding your critical systems And the disconnect between that and being able to critically function is a caveat where threat actors are specifically focusing, right? That's where they want to target and have the biggest bang for their buck, so to speak. So I think that's really I won't use the wake up call, but I think that's the realization across the board, is that business continuity and critical functions are not the same thing as your critical assets or your crown jewels. It's the interplay between those two that we really have to continue to work to secure, while our threat actors are continuing to innovate how they target those exact interdependencies.
And speaking of the crown jewels, thinking back to the Colonial incident, and Kurt, maybe you can weigh in on this.
Mm-hmm.
What if the worst case happened there? What if ransomware actors were able to breach the OT? I got the sense from this that DarkSide perhaps and their affiliates were in over their heads a little bit and perhaps didn't quite realize the magnitude of what they were doing there. But, a lot of this ransomware it's a bull in a china shop, right? It just doesn't really care what sort of files it's encrypting. It doesn't necessarily check that it's actually not disabling some US critical infrastructure. What do you do there? Like, what does the response look like? Do people just end up needing to pay to, decrypt these really critical files that are underpinning US critical infrastructure? What would happen if the hackers did succeed in breaching that OT?
That is a really difficult question. Let me first say what Danielle mentioned, +1, and then I'll mention really quickly. I think a lot of organizations, more than you would think, don't understand their risk profile, or their risk appetite, I should say. Both profile, but more so here I'm talking appetite. So, because I've seen plenty of organizations in my previous life as a consultant and an auditor, used to be a pen tester as well, that'll say, hey, look, we're very conservative when it comes to risk, but when you delve deeper, it turns out that where the decision is made, they tend to be very aggressive when it comes to risk. So I'd just like to tack that on to what Danielle said. I got a call from a colleague of mine in South America, and it hasn't happened to us, but they were seeing this increasing. It's not by any means a large, a huge thing, but it's increasing, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 per year, where a couple of different things happen. Either, this is the insider threat part, the attackers go to an administrator, whether on the IT side, let's say OT side, someone who manages a network or a facility, and says, look, I'll send you an email, click this button, don't worry about anything else. At the end of the day, and you try to move this along, at the end of the day, we'll ask for $3 million, you'll get 40%, right? So that's one example of an insider threat. The second one is is sort of like a new play on tiger kidnapping. If you haven't heard what tiger kidnapping is where an untoward organization, and this is probably where cyber physical comes into play as well, an untoward organization then kidnaps and or threatens a family member and says, you have 2.5 hours to go into the office, plug in this USB and deploy this thing. And we did some war gaming through how we would handle those types of situations. I mentioned those because it goes back to Danielle's earlier point of the innovations, and this is really horrific innovation, by the way, that the adversaries are thinking through to try to make their mission successful. What do we do if something is severely ransomware? I'll be honest, if it puts life or limb at risk, this is me, not as the chief cybersecurity officer of Siemens, but me personally. If I have a family member that's at risk, or something I'm responsible for where someone may die, the likelihood of me paying, I wouldn't say it's yes, but the likelihood of me paying is increased. So it's a very nuanced question. If you talk to the FBI, they'll say no, and I've spoken to a few people over there. If you talk to maybe CISA, they'll say we won't comment. And that's not a knock. That's actually probably the best thing they can say. So you'll get different responses from different people. I would say this is where the federal government, because the second something like that starts to happen, you're trying to weigh the chances that attackers are going to notice this and increase their attacks with trying to get operations back on the way. And this is the perfect place for the federal government to step in really, and asymmetrical cyber warfare comes into play, because private institutions, while we do own the majority of operations, the internet, etc., we are not in a position to defend forward. It's just way too messy. We might defend forward and do something that then causes two nation states to get into issue. So I would look to the federal government as they're wargaming this, they're simulating these types of events for guidance from the federal government, which is why I'm a big fan of what CIS has been doing with JCDC now expanding into the ICS space and together trying to think through these very complex, difficult questions. That I didn't answer your question, but I sort of did.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I did want to give a chance for members of the audience to ask a couple quick questions here. I know we're running up on time. If anybody had a question, Derek, if you want to ask, I can try to repeat it.
Yeah, hey, so the federal government has put out a number of proposed regulations for critical infrastructure over the last year, pipeline, water and wastewater. There has been some debate and kind of criticism about sort of how well those regulations may or may not be customized to those particular sectors and what they need. I'm curious, and to the extent that you all can talk about it on the gov side, what sort of lessons have you been able to draw from that experience? And then to the extent that Kurt or Danielle wanted to weigh in, what sort of lessons do you think the federal government should have derived from that experience?
So just to quickly follow up, the question was about regulations and really tailoring to certain sectors, pipeline, water, and lessons from that experience. I don't know if Jason or Daniel, you want to start with that one.
Sure. I'll say a couple words and then kick it over to Daniel. I think elevating cybersecurity has been a huge priority of the Biden administration since day one, right? And you can look at that from initial executive actions that were taken, particularly on the ICS front, continues to be a top priority. You look at the team that he's brought together at the NSC, at ONCD, et cetera. So top priority, and that's manifesting itself in different ways. There's actions being taken at the White House, working with Congress on a number of fronts, and then departments and agencies, or what we call SRMAs, Sector Risk Management Agencies, are driving forward as well to address the risk and threat for their particular sectors. And I think I'll hit the point at a very high level. I think it comes back to what I said earlier. If you've seen one sector, you've seen one sector, right? And pipelines is different than water, is different than medical. But I really like how Danielle emphasized critical functions, which is how we think about it at the White House as well. And the interconnectedness is critical as well. And so I come back to this, my broader point on taking a look at our critical infrastructure protection framework. And we constantly need to stress test that and continue to evaluate that. Trust in our departments and agencies that have the expertise in those sectors to mitigate the risks that they best can, working in close partnership with the industry. And we've emphasized partnership to try to get it right. And you balance that with, frankly, limited authorities and capabilities that vary by agency. And so sometimes that ends up in a little different approaches based on the authorities that you have to try to put your finger in the dike. So I think pressing forward, continuing to emphasize that partnership, and working closely with industry to do what we can together. I don't know what you want to add on that.
I'll just add, totally agree on the partnership bit. One quick thing I'll add from this is a perspective, again, not being the regulator, but being the technical advisor. This is definitely a mission, especially for me and my team, and there have already been cases where we become privy to efforts across government to bring some sort of harder hammer down from a cybersecurity perspective, and we can see the dots and connect to dots and say, hey, how do we take a quick pause and make sure we're aligning on these efforts before we have many different expectations across many different sectors? I think our approach on the performance goals kind of follows that ethos as well, where all the sectors are different, but there is a very strong common baseline, which is what we call the cross-sector performance goals. We call the common baseline. Let's just knock that out before we have however many SRMAs putting out the same regs that say the same things. And then after we do this common baseline, like I said, we'll go sector by sector, working on those more niche considerations to make sure that the guidance we're putting out makes sense. And another thing too that is a hard nut to crack is, we RMAs who are responsible for overseeing risk and regulating within the sectors. Some of them are much more well-equipped, well-staffed, and knowledgeable than others. And so there's a bit of a asymmetry there. And again, there's something as CISA as kind of the central coordinator advisor for a lot of this stuff. How can we help level up not only the critical infrastructure entities, but also the SRMAs so they can each do their job effectively?
Danielle, Kurt, any quick closing thoughts to add on that?
I have a whole session today on standards. And so the customization of the technology that's purpose built across so many different sectors versus not being able to report on what you can actually see, find, or hunt versus things that you can copy and paste from one sector to another are all themes I'm going to touch on this afternoon. So I'll just turn it over to Kurt for time.
Yeah, I think the lesson the government should have taken away from it is the lesson that it did, right? And that is that we're stronger together. You have to be one of us. And I'm quoting Chris Inglis here when we met. Stronger together, you have to be all of us to beat one of us, because what typically happens in these attacks is that it's a very focused, isolated attack on one entity. And the more that we can share information, we can get the support of the government through these tactics, tools, scripts, regulation, which, you know, the intent is always phenomenal, but have to work with private industry to understand how it's implemented. All of those to me are lessons that should have been taken away, and were, because I think it was either Daniel that mentioned the team, or maybe it was Jason, the team that President Biden has put together across the, you know, ODNI, ONCD, CISA, NSA, now with their new director of strategy. It's just phenomenal. So this is the perfect time to continue to build this public-private partnership that's just yielding a lot of value. So 2 thumbs up from my end.
Another thumbs up for the lack of kind of fear mongering for the government. Again, so the government's done an excellent job of articulating, this is what we're worried about, this is why we're worried about it, and this is why you should not panic. These are the steps we are taking. When I was doing work in nuclear weapons cybersecurity, the New York Times headline of the worst case scenario was what people kind of ran with, instead of the less sexy DDoS attack on a missile silo in Nebraska. And I think the government's done an excellent job when it comes to critical infrastructure of not doing the kind of extra hyperbolic kind of New York Times, any type of media headline kind of chasing. So I would commend Daniel and Jason's teams for that.
Yep. Thank you. And with that, we are a little bit over time here, and I wanted to thank the panelists, thank the Atlantic Council, and of course, Carl and Mooring for hosting us here. And thank you all for coming and being with us here for a lively and very informative discussion. So really appreciate everyone's time. And with that, we'll hand things back over.